Hi guys, I'm here with another process video showing how I used 6x6 inch papers on a full-size layout. Technically, I used 6x8 inch papers with this one, but the same concept applies. What you can do with 6x6 inch papers, you can do with 6x8 inch papers as well. Or if you have accumulated a lot of scraps, and if you're anything like me, I'm sure you have, this is a great design to help you use some of those up. I actually ended up using a sketch for this layout. I just released 4 new sketch bundles last week, and 2 of them are for 6x6 inch papers. And there were several of those sketches that I really couldn't wait to use. So this video felt like a good excuse to try one out. If you are new to scrapbooking with 6x6 inch papers, these sketches can help you get started and get a feel for how to work with these smaller papers. And I'll link to those sketches down below. And while you're checking out those links, I would greatly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button as well. For this layout design, I have a large background made up of triangles arranged in different directions so that they kind of lock together, creating this 8x12 inch background. One of my favorite ways to create with 6x6 inch papers is to find ways to use smaller pieces together to create a larger design. That's definitely the most common concept in these 6x6 paper pad videos. Because you are working with a smaller size of paper, you often have to think of ways you can group and arrange smaller pieces together to create a bigger design. One of my go-to design concepts is creating a pattern. If I were using full 12-inch papers, a layout like this could have a single large 8x12-inch pattern paper right here. But because using a single piece that large isn't possible with 6x6 inch papers, we have to think a little differently. One way to do that is to think of different patterns you can create with smaller pieces to cover that same 8x12-inch area. I used triangles, which is the same shape that was used on the sketch. You could also use squares, vertical strips, horizontal strips, circles, or hexagons, to name a few. Or to simplify, you could just use 2 6x6 inch sheets together to create one 6x12 inch background. There are so many possibilities and patterns you can create. To begin, I start by cutting the triangles. These are all 2-inch triangles, and the obvious, easiest option would be to use a die cutting machine. But I always like to show how you can do stuff like this without those, since not everybody has one. And while it does look like a lot to cut out, there's actually a really easy way to cut these triangles without taking up a lot of time. I started with several 2x6 inch strips of paper in multiple patterns. I used my ruler to draw on one side to make a small pencil mark every 2 inches, which ends up being the 2-inch and 4-inch mark on the ruler. Then on the other side, I made a pencil mark 1 inch from the first edge, and then marks every 2 inches, which ends up being the 1, 3, and 5-inch mark on the ruler. To make the first cut, I line up the bottom corner of the strip and the first pencil mark on the top side with my blade track on my paper trimmer and cut. Then I line up that top side mark that was just cut with the next pencil mark on the bottom and cut. I repeat this until I have the whole strip cut. You will get 5 2-inch triangles out of that one 2x6 inch strip. After all of the triangles are cut, I start arranging them on the layout. I like to start in the middle. I know that might sound like a strange place to start, but I've learned that when piecing designs together like this, sometimes when you arrange them all together, you start at the top edge, and by the time you get to the bottom, the pieces overlap off the layout just a little bit. It doesn't sound like that big of a deal. You can just trim it off. But for someone like me who tends to be a perfectionist, it would drive me crazy that the triangles at the bottom are slightly shorter than the rest of the triangles. Starting in the middle ensures that the triangles at the top and bottom will be the same, even if they overlap off the edge and I have to trim them. Another thing I want to mention, I distressed the edges of the triangles by running my fingernail along the edge, creating kind of a rough edge. I like to do this especially when creating patterns. Even if you are super careful cutting and arranging those triangle pieces, sometimes they don't fit together as well as you had hoped. And having that rough edge kind of helps to hide that. When I'm finished with the triangles, I add my photos. The sketch had 3 photos, but I only had 2 that I wanted to use. Whenever I am creating a pattern like this, I like to go in and add lots of stitching. I am a stitching addict, so I just can't help myself when it comes to designs like this. I'm going to add a stitch border on several of the triangles. To begin, I use a ruler and pencil to draw my lines about 1/8 of an inch from the edges. After all the pencil lines are drawn, I put my layout on a foam mat and use a paper piercer to pierce holes along those pencil lines. I typically shoot for spacing that is somewhere between 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch. When all of those holes are pierced, I use an eraser to erase all of the pencil lines. I do this to ensure that no pencil lines show and also to keep my white thread from getting smudgy and dirty. To begin stitching, I use 3 strands of 6-strand embroidery floss and I anchor it to the back side of the layout with a small piece of masking tape. Then I stitch through the holes using a back stitch. If you are new to stitching or you want to see my full process and tips, I have a stitching video that I will link to down below. I chose to use white embroidery floss for this design. Whenever I'm stitching a pattern, I tend to go with a neutral thread that coordinates with all of the colors on my layout, instead of only stitching with a matching color on each individual triangle. I do this for 2 reasons. One, to me, it gives almost a quilt-like look, which I really, really like. And 2, this background is already pretty busy with all of the different colors and patterns, so I wanted the stitching to be a more subtle, textured detail that doesn't distract too much from the photos. After I finished the stitching, I decided to add a few more triangles. I had a little idea pop in my head, and part of it involved adding some smaller triangles on top of the triangles already on the layout. I cut several 1.5-inch triangles out of a white grid pattern paper, and later on I'm going to add something on top of them to go with the theme of my layout. I also wanted to add stitching around the edges of these triangles as well. I followed the same steps as before, using a ruler and pencil to draw the lines, then using a foam mat and paper piercer to pierce the holes, erasing the pencil lines, and then stitching with 3 strands and using a back stitch. Now, with the stitching done, I can start adding all of my embellishments, the title, and the journaling. I start with the title. I like to lay things out first and make sure I like the arrangement and spacing before I commit to adhering it all down. I used a foam summer word and some block letters to spell out sweet. I also added a watermelon die cut to the left edge of the summer title and a watermelon sticker to the right edge. Next, I add my journaling along with another watermelon sticker and a vine sticker as well. At this point, I just start adding more little details to my 3 watermelon clusters. First, I added some small flower stickers. Then I added some word stickers, a few more flowers, and another little watermelon on the bottom right. With all of my embellishments done, I am now going to add little red hearts on every smaller white triangle on the background design. I used foam adhesive to add some dimension as well. I thought this was a fun way to add a little more detail to that background while playing around with the theme too. After I had all of the hearts on the layout, I felt like I didn't get a nice even spread of the hearts, and there was kind of a hole in the middle of the background. So I cut another white triangle and then stitched on the edge of it and finished with another red heart to the center. After that, I felt like the background was more balanced. The last detail I added was using some Nuvo Dream Drops in Cloud 9 to add to the center of each flowers on the layout. And that's all for this layout. The stitching really added a lot of extra time here. It always does, since it's a more time-consuming technique. But if you focus on just the triangle background, for as much detail that has, this design really does come together quickly. And you can have a lot of fun with this triangle pattern. You could create a rainbow design or ombre color fade. If you wanted to tone it down a bit, you could only use 2 pattern papers alternating as you go, or you could use larger and less triangles. You can also have some fun with adding little themed elements to a few triangles like I did with the hearts. I hope you enjoyed this layout, and if you are looking for some fun designs using 6x6" papers, be sure to check out my other scrapbooking with 6x6" paper pad videos. And I have tons of sketches specifically made for using 6x6" papers, and I'll link to all of them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.